All right, welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into the source material you sent over today, looking at performance indicators and critical success factors.
Yeah, it's a really fundamental topic, isn't it? Whether you're trying to figure out, the strategic direction for an organization or just evaluating how well it's actually performing day to day.
Exactly. So the mission today is really to unpack these concepts. What are they? Why are they so important? And maybe most importantly, how do they all connect? Because it can get a bit confusing. The sources you gave us cover quite a bit. Definitions, plenty of examples, pitfalls to watch out for, even a practical framework. And they show how these ideas link up with, well, pretty much everything else in business.
It's sort of the toolkit for understanding success, really. How do organizations know if they're actually winning? And what are the absolute non-negotiables they just have to get right? That's what we're exploring.
Okay, let's get into it then. Let's start right at the beginning. Performance. The sources define it simply as a task or operation seen in terms of how successfully it is performed. Seems straightforward.
Right, but the key word there is successfully. What does that actually mean? It varies massively, doesn't it? For a commercial company, sure, it might be profit, share price maybe.
But for, say, a hospital?
Totally different. Curing patients, reducing waiting lists, or a council clearing rubbish efficiently. Success looks different everywhere. And the sources stress this idea is right at the heart of strategic decision-making and performance management. How do you know your strategy is working if you haven't defined what good looks like?
And they mentioned that the primary tasks, the really core things an organization does, often come straight out of its mission statement.
Exactly. Like you said, a hospital's primary task is healing people. A business, maybe it's making a profit, serving customers in a specific way. That's the main goal.
But then there are all these other tasks supporting that primary one.
Yeah, that's subsidiary tasks, things like product design, keeping costs down, ensuring quality, being flexible, marketing, all that stuff. And the sources make a good point that many of these are non-financial achievements, but they're still vital.
So it's not all equal. There are things that are just sort of nice to have, and then there are the things that are absolutely critical.
Definitely. The airline example in the sources illustrates this perfectly. Nice meals, good movies on the flight, they're nice, sure.
But they don't matter if the plane's always late.
Or worse, unsafe. Punctuality, reliability, and above all, safety prevails. Those are critical. If safety fails, nothing else counts. Those are the core elements of performance for an airline.
Okay, that makes sense. So that brings us naturally to objectives. These are the specific targets the organization sets.
And the crucial distinction the sources make here is that objectives are the quantified parts of the mission. The mission gives the broad purpose, the why. Objectives turn that into what by when, with numbers attached.
And that quantification is absolutely key, isn't it? Because you can't measure performance effectively without a clear target. Objectives are the foundation. How do you know if a result is good or bad if you haven't defined what you were aiming for?
You're just flying blind otherwise. And organizations usually have this hierarchy, right? Big corporate objectives, then more detailed ones for specific departments or business units.
And primary versus secondary objectives too.
Yeah, exactly. A primary objective might be, say, grow profits by 10%. The secondary objectives might be how you plan to do that, improve quality to justify higher prices, or increase efficiency to lower costs. Those secondary ones are often the strategies, the methods.
Got it. And to make sure these objectives are actually useful, the sources bring up the SMART criteria: specific, measurable, achievable, or agreed accepted, relevant and time limited. Classic stuff, but important.
Foundational, really, and easier said than done sometimes. Take specific. It sounds obvious, but you need real clarity. Something like improve inventory is just too woolly.
Right. What does improve mean? Fewer stockouts.
Or lower holding costs. Better warehouse layout. You need to pin it down precisely.
Then measurable, well, that seems non-negotiable. If you can't measure it, how can you track progress or know if you've hit it?
You can't control what you can't measure. And even for the softer things, like customer satisfaction, the sources remind us you can find ways. Surveys, feedback scores, repeat business rates, they're usually proxies you can quantify.
Then achievable or agreed, accepted. This seems crucial for getting people on board.
Totally. If the people who actually have to do the work think the target is impossible or just unfair, they won't buy into it. It just kills motivation. So that agreement, that acceptance, it's vital
And relevant. The sources make a really interesting point here. It's not just relevant to the company's big goals, but relevant to the individual, too.
Yes. If an employee looks at their objective and thinks, well, this doesn't really affect the company's success, or worse, there's nothing I can actually do to influence this number, then, well, the sources say it breeds cynicism, detachment.
Which completely undermines the whole point. And finally, time limited. Deadlines matter.
They focus the mind, prevent things drifting forever. Standard project management, really, but applied to objectives.
Okay, so performance is the act. Objectives are the specific, measurable targets. Now let's talk critical success factor CSFs. The basic idea is these are the areas where you absolutely must do well to succeed.
Right. But the sources offer a more insightful definition, the one from Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington. They frame it around the customer.
Yes, that one. CSFs are those product features that are particularly valued by a group of customers where the organization must excel to outperform the competition.
Exactly. And that customer focus is really powerful, isn't it? It shifts the perspective outwards. It's not just about what you think is important inside the company. It's about what your customers or your patients or your citizens, what they value most.
And if you don't deliver on those things, you're in trouble. It's about avoiding failure by meeting those core external needs.
That's why they're critical. Get these wrong and you'll likely fail because you lose the people you exist to serve. It links performance directly to stakeholder value.
Okay, so we've got our performance definition, our SMART objectives, and we know the CSFs, the make or break areas based often on customer needs. How do we actually track if we're hitting those objectives and excelling in those critical areas? That must be where performance indicators, PIs, come in.
Precisely. PIs or performance measures, they're simply the methods you use to assess how you're doing.
So for a business, the obvious ones, profit, earnings per share, return on capital.
Yep. And for a nonprofit or public service, maybe exam grades in a school, waiting times in a hospital, road conditions for a local authority.
But the sources make a really key distinction. Those high-level PIs, like the final profit number, they tell you what happened, the outcome.
But not how or why. High profit, great. But was it because sales volume shot up? Or did you hike prices? Or slash costs somewhere? Those underlying drivers matter.
Right, you need to measure those too, like the school literacy example in the sources. High literacy scores might be the main PI reflecting the CSF.
But to actually improve literacy, you need to understand the determinants. What drives it? Pupil-teacher ratio, attendance rates, teacher experience. You need PIs for those underlying factors as well, so you know which levers to pull.
Which brings us neatly to key performance indicators, KPIs. Just like CSFs are more critical than other aspects of performance.
Not all PIs are created equal. Some are more important than others.
So KPIs are?
KPIs are the PIs that measure the most important things. They're the indicators directly linked to your critical success factors. They tell you how well you're doing on the stuff that truly matters for success. Other PIs track other, perhaps less critical aspects.
Okay, so the ideal flow is understand your mission, set SMART objectives, identify your CSFs, often customer-focused, and then choose the KPIs that directly measure performance against those CSFs.
That's the theory, yes. But as the sources really hammer home, designing these measures and the systems around them is fraught with difficulty. There are loads of potential pitfalls.
Yeah, let's talk about those. The first one mentioned is not having enough measures.
Right. It's that classic line, whatever gets measured gets done. But the corollary the sources highlight is maybe even more important. Whatever doesn't get measured doesn't get done. If something vital isn't tracked, it naturally slips down the priority list.
Makes sense. But the opposite is also a problem, having too many indicators.
Oh, definitely. Information overload, especially if they aren't ranked or weighted. Think about the time and effort involved measuring, calculating, reporting. It's huge. And what happens? People might focus on the easy, trivial measures they can hit, rather than the difficult, really important ones.
Just ticking boxes instead of focusing on what matters.
Oh.
Okay, what else? Using the wrong measures.
This one can be really damaging. Using measures that actively contradict your strategy. The example given is spot on. A luxury brand aiming for differentiation, top quality, exclusivity.
And then management imposes really strict traditional cost control PIs on everything?
Exactly. It forces departments to cut corners on materials, maybe skimp on service, undermining the very strategy the company is built on. Your measures have to align with your strategic goals.
Okay, that's a big one. What about targets being too tight or too loose?
Both are bad. Targets that feel impossible just demotivate people. Or worse, it encourages gaming the system, fiddling the numbers, misrepresenting things just to hit the target, even if real performance hasn't improved.
And targets that are too easy.
They don't stretch anyone. Performance tends to drift down to meet the low expectation. The sources suggest benchmarking, looking at competitors or internal best practice, can help set more realistic but challenging targets.
Right, not just basing it on last year's numbers plus a bit. And the last pitfall mentioned is what they call hit-and-run indicators.
Yeah, just setting up a measure and thinking the job's done, assuming it will just work.
But it won't, will it?
Not without a proper management framework around it. It's not just about the number, it's about how that number is collected, reported, understood, and crucially, acted upon.
Which leads perfectly into the practical framework the sources provide. They suggest a 10-point checklist for each measure. Let's use their train company example, TTTE, measuring punctuality.
Okay, so point 1, title. Simple enough, 0% trains on time. Point 2, purpose strategic link. This is key. For TTTE, punctuality is linked directly to their strategic objective of reliable service, a core competitive factor. That tells everyone why this matters.
So it anchors the measure. Then point 3, other measures affected. This makes you think about trade-offs, right?
Exactly. Pushing for punctuality might impact safety. You don't want drivers speeding. Or maybe train cleanliness suffers if turnaround times are cut, or fuel consumption goes up. You need to consider those potential conflicts up front.
Very important. Then responsibility, who owns this KPI?
For TTE, it's the operations director. Clear accountability. Then point 5, the nitty-gritty. Source data, measurement, calculation. How is on time defined? Is there a margin, like 5 minutes? Who logs the data? How's the percentage calculated? You need that operational detail.
And point 6 seems vital for avoiding that hit-and-run issue, investigations, explanations. What happens if you miss the target?
Yeah, this is crucial. The sources say TTTE requires station managers to record the readings for delays. The operations director then collates and analyzes this, looking for patterns, specific routes, times of day, recurring issues.
So you're not just tracking the number, you're actively diagnosing the problems behind it.
Exactly, so you can actually fix things. The framework also covers target determination. How is the target set? The timetable itself. Target update. How often are targets reviewed? Reporting frequency, weekly in TTE's case. And finally, reporting in action. Who gets the reports and what are they expected to do with them?
It really turns a simple metric into a whole management system. It feels much more robust, like a way to actually avoid those pitfalls we talked about.
It absolutely is. And the sources then take this further, showing how performance measurement isn't this isolated activity. It's woven into everything else a business does.
Yeah, that section really connected the dots. It wasn't just listing business concepts, but showing the interaction, like how your overall generic strategy cost leadership versus differentiation fundamentally shapes your CSFs and KPIs.
That's a critical link the sources make. If you're competing on cost, your CSFs are all about efficiency, waste reduction, productivity. So your KPIs will reflect that cost per unit, output per employee, material variance.
But if you're differentiating,
then your CSFs are about things like innovation, quality, brand image, customer experience. So your KPIs shift completely, maybe defect rates, time to market for new products, customer satisfaction scores, brand perception metrics, using cost leader KPIs for a differentiator or vice versa. It's a recipe for disaster, as we saw in the pitfalls.
Totally misaligned. And the link to human resource management also stood out. People actually do the performing.
You can't separate them. Performance management have to connect to HRM. How effective is your training? What's individual job performance like? Are employees satisfied? What are your recruitment and retention rates? These become really important PIs because they measure the capability and motivation of your workforce, which directly enables or hinders achieving your CSFs.
And then linking pay and rewards to performance metrics, that adds another whole layer of complexity.
Which ties right back to those pitfalls about relevance and achievability, doesn't it? If your HR systems, your appraisal systems, your reward systems aren't aligned with the critical performance measures, the whole thing can fall apart. People work towards what they're measured and rewarded on.
Right. The sources also brought up stakeholder analysis. Different groups care about different things.
Yeah, shareholders might focus purely on profit and ROCE financial PIs. Customers care about quality, service, value, often linked to non-financial CSFs. Employees care about pay, conditions, development, internal measures. The community might care about environmental impact or local jobs.
And these can conflict sometimes.
They often do. So designing a balanced set of measures means acknowledging these different stakeholder perspectives and figuring out how to manage the potential tensions. It's not easy.
So these concepts are deeply interconnected. The sources also briefly mention specific performance measurement models.
They did. Things like the balanced scorecard, the performance pyramid, and Fitzgerald and Moon's building blocks model. The common thread is they all push beyond purely financial measures.
Trying to get a more holistic view.
Exactly. Quality, innovation, flexibility, stakeholder perspectives, delivery times, trying to capture the different dimensions of performance.
The sources seem to give Fitzgerald and Moon a bit more airtime, particularly because they explicitly link measures to individual responsibility.
Yes, that's highlighted as their unique angle. Their model has two sides: results of the outcomes, like financial performance and competitive position, and determinants, the things that drive those results, like quality, flexibility, resource utilization, innovation. So it builds in that cause and effect linkage.
And they also set standards for the KPIs themselves, things like ownership, achievability, and fairness.
Which, again, connects directly back to avoiding those pitfalls, getting people to feel genuine ownership of a metric, ensuring the targets are challenging but not seen as impossible, and making sure the measurement feels fair, like accounting for things outside someone's control or problems caused elsewhere. These are huge practical challenges.
If you get those wrong, motivation plummets, and people might start gaming the system.
Absolutely. And the sources point out this gets even more complex when you tie rewards to these KPIs. Fitzgerald and Moon have criteria for reward systems too. Clarity people need to understand exactly how performance translates into reward. Motivation, the reward itself has to be valued, and achieving it must seem possible.
Yeah.
And controllable.
Controllable, meaning the person being rewarded has to actually be able to influence the KPI.
Yes, that's critical. Rewarding or penalizing someone based on a metric they have zero control over is just fundamentally unfair and incredibly demotivating. The sources really stress that connecting metrics to rewards needs very careful thought to avoid unintended negative consequences.
Wow. Okay, that really was a deep dive. We started with the basics, defining performance, setting objective. Then we dug into identifying those truly critical success factors, finding the right indicators, the KPIs to measure them. We looked at all the ways it can go wrong, the pitfalls.
And then the framework for doing it right, building a system around each measure.
And finally, seeing how it all connects to strategy, to people, to stakeholders, to specific models like Fitzgerald and Moon.
It really shows that performance measurement isn't just some, back office accounting task. It's a core strategic activity. It's about linking what you measure directly to your purpose, your strategy, what your customers value, what your stakeholders need, and making sure your people are aligned and engaged with it. It's complex.
The sources definitely paint a picture of needing careful design, a solid framework, and continuous effort to keep everything aligned. It's not a one-off exercise.
Absolutely. Which leads to a final thought, perhaps. Given all this complexity, balancing different stakeholder views, avoiding perverse incentives from the wrong measures, making it fair and motivating for individuals, especially when rewards are involved.
How can any organization realistically design a system that perfectly balances all of that? A system that truly captures its purpose, genuinely motivates people towards the right things, and drives the right kind of success without unintended consequences? That's quite a challenge to ponder based on everything we've discussed from the sources.